I'd like to welcome you all to this webinar because I want to try to demystify and maybe make GDPR for Office 365 administrators a little bit less scary. You might wonder why I picked a title like Surviving the Aftermath if I'm trying to make things less scary, because it sort of sounds like a disaster movie. But the fact of the matter is, when you think about GDPR, it's not quite the extinction level thing that we all feared, or at least it hasn't been yet. So GDPR has an impact on a lot of organizations of different sizes in different locations, frequently in ways that they don't expect. But it's also true that in some ways GDPR is a correction, if you will, to a long chain of companies being very careless with their users and customers' personal data. So now that GDPR is in effect, right, the hammer has fallen, and we're all stuck with having to live with GDPR as the law of the land. Even if we're in the US, now this is something a lot of people have questions about. I'm going to address it in just a second. But since GDPR took effect, I love this quote from the Hitchhiker's Galaxy. This has made a lot of people very angry and been widely regarded as a bad idea, because that's what's happened in a lot of cases. For example, I frequently talk to coworkers in Europe who are irritated that major US news outlets like the Orlando Sentinel don't allow European visitors to go to their sites. Rather than try to figure out what it means to be compliant with GDPR, they just block people who are outside North America, which really not very polite, but you can sort of understand why they did it. Customers, companies of all sizes in all different domains are really confused about what GDPR means to them. The press has not helped. There's been a lot of fear, uncertainty, and doubt exposed in the press about what GDPR means, what you have to do to be compliant, and so on. So typically the first question that people have is, do I have to comply with GDPR? Right after that, the second thing that they typically ask is, okay, well, if I have to comply, what does it mean to quote unquote comply? What does it mean for me as an educational institution, as a state or local government agency, as a manufacturing company that doesn't have any operations in Europe, as a multinational that has some operations in Europe and some operations in other places? How can I avoid getting fined? Okay, this is really what's sort of underlying a lot of the questions about GDPR. People want to know, what do they have to do to qualify or to comply with the law just well enough to make sure that they don't end up costing their company a lot of money and getting fired when you get right down to it? What about if I'm not in Europe? Does that make a difference? What about Brexit? This is a fascinating question for us at Quadratech because we have significant operations in the UK. And right now we sort of depend on the UK being part of the EU and having free motion of trade and people and property and money back and forth. So at some point after Brexit, there's going to be an adjustment period, if you will, where people have to figure out, okay, if I'm subject to GDPR, does that change anything about the way I operate in the UK? There are a lot of other questions too, right? I mean, we could easily talk for days and days and days about all the things that people are worried about or want to know about GDPR. But I have some good news for you. We're not going to talk about any of that today. And the reason for that is that this webinar is not to really help you assess whether or not you have to comply with GDPR or whether GDPR is applicable to you. I'm going to go ahead and assume that everybody who has Office 365 is going to be subject to some of the same requirements that are imposed by GDPR. Now notice what I said there. I was very careful about my word choice. I didn't say that everybody who's using Office 365 is subject to GDPR, because obviously that wouldn't be true. But if you're using Office 365, no matter where you are, no matter where your customers are, no matter how big or how small you are, some of the things that GDPR legally requires are things that your business continuity and safety will also require. So I could spend probably the next 2 hours talking about the fine points of getting into compliance with GDPR if you're an Office 365 customer. But I don't want to do that because I don't think that would be productive or useful. Instead, I'd like to try to cherry pick a couple of areas where there are easy wins that every Office 365 customer can leverage to help them improve their ability to comply with GDPR. And one of the big ones, which has the side benefit of being useful to people who are not subject to GDPR too, is improving the way that you respond to data breaches or potential data breaches. So GDPR is really super, super, super clear on exactly what you have to do if you believe a breach has occurred. Obviously, first you have to detect it, then you have to determine its scope, then you have to report it. This is where a lot of people are concerned right now. Then you have to remediate it. If you fail to do those things, then you can be fined millions of dollars or euro, basically up to 4% of your gross revenue. Now, lest you think that that's an idle threat, if you look at the size of the fines at the EU anti-competition, or sorry, it's not the anti-competition office, their antitrust agency. If you look at the size of the fines that they have hammered on Apple and Microsoft and Google, don't for a minute believe that the EU data protection system will not impose these fines if they feel like there's a reason to. Now, here's the thing. It's not automatic that you'll be fined if you have a breach. This is an area that a lot of people are very concerned about. So let me put your mind at ease. I mean, first of all, yes, you're absolutely right to be worried about breaches because there's a lot of breaching going on. Some of the best funded, best secured enterprises in the world have been targeted, attacked, and penetrated. Home Depot was one in the US, the UK National Health Service, the shipping line Maersk, Yahoo, Equifax, eBay. I mean, I could give a much longer list, but I think you all get the general idea. The city of Atlanta is one of my favorites. For GDPR purposes, though, the important thing to keep in mind is that breach is pretty broadly defined. It does not necessarily mean that your network has been penetrated and ransomware or spyware has been installed, or that you can prove that somebody has stolen data. It's very simple. A breach is anytime somebody accesses data that they're not authorized to have. Okay, think about that for 1 second. It doesn't have to be related to criminal, some kind of criminal action. It doesn't have to be related to a case where you catch somebody. Anytime you have reasonable suspicion that someone has seen protected data that they were not supposed to see, that counts as a breach. So we could do some scenarios. For example, let's say that I have a data system that contains protected data. Actually, let me back up a second. Let me talk about what protected data means in the context of GDPR. And I use the term protected. That's not the term that the GDPR folks use. They use personal data. And the short layman's definition of that is any data that can uniquely identify a person. So you probably have a pretty good intuitive understanding that that would include things such as a person's full name, their birth date, their social security or social insurance number, and so on. If you actually read the GDPR regulations, genetic data is included. Data about religious and sexual and political orientations are included. There's a whole bunch of other stuff that we probably don't think of as being uniquely identified in at least the US business world, but that still counts as GDPR protected. So let's say you have a case where you have reason to think that somebody had some sensitive data on a USB stick that they lost. Well, there's no criminal action. They didn't lose it on purpose. They were authorized to have it in the first place. But the minute that stick is lost, that's a breach, and you have to report it because you don't know what happened to the data once your employee lost it. Okay, very simple case, happens all the time. If an employee loses a mobile phone that might contain protected data, that counts. So for example, if someone were to break into my marketing team's offices and steal a laptop that might have customer data on it, like the leads from this webinar, as far as GDPR folks are concerned, that would constitute a breach because there was some data that uniquely identifies humans and it got out. So with that definition in mind, you can see that we're not just talking about these kind of really flashy showbiz style hacker attacks like you see in a Mission Impossible movie. Anytime you have reason to think that someone outside your organization may have gotten access to protected data, you're legally required to treat it as a breach under GDPR. So let's talk about what the life cycle of these breaches look like. So first, everything's going on normally. Customers are buying whatever it is you sell. You're doing whatever it is you do to run your business, whether that's making widgets or filing lawsuits or educating children or flying airplanes. Everything's going along fine. And then somehow you have a breach, whether this breach is because you made a security configuration mistake, because someone affirmatively stole it, because someone was careless and it got lost, doesn't matter. Now here's the tricky part. You have to have some way to detect that breach. It's entirely possible that you don't have an intrusion detection system or auditing or anything like that in place. And so maybe you find out about the breach because one of your customers has an email address that they only use to talk to you, and they start getting spam on it. All of a sudden, they're going to be pretty angry with you because you breached their data. And they can file a complaint with the regulator or the data protection office in their home country if they're under GDPR. Of course, if they're in the US, we don't have anything like that. So I guess that means you're off the hook, but not really. And make no mistake, one thing I want to make really clear to the US folks on this call, we don't have GDPR equivalents in the United States, but we're going to. California has already started that process. And once they do, and once their legislation is finalized and passed and gets past the inevitable court challenges, I guarantee you 100% you will see other states doing it. There's a lot of momentum building from consumers and end users who are tired of companies being careless with their data. Not pointing any fingers at Facebook, but you can see where I'm coming from there. So once you become aware that a breach occurred, either because you detected it through your security systems or because you somehow get an out-of-channel notification, the next thing you need to do is you need to scope it and see what data was lost or might have been lost. Then you remediate the breach. Perhaps the remediation is that you become aware that you had a security, you set a permission wrong on a data blob that you had stored in Amazon Web Services. Okay, so you make sure all the blob permissions are set properly, and you do whatever you can to remedy the potential harm to the people whose data was exposed, and then you go back to normal operations. So really these 5 steps are what most people think of as the core of managing any kind of data breach or network penetration. Now notice that from the standpoint of GDPR, there's a 6th step that we didn't talk about. That's notification. So what I would encourage you to do if you are in the EU, you should absolutely read Article 33 of the GDPR. And if you're not, I still think it makes for pretty good reading because it sets out what the European Union's expectations are for notifying people that their data may have been compromised. So if you think, for example, of the major breaches in the United States with Equifax or with the Federal Office of Personnel Management breach, where security clearance data for millions of people was stolen by the Chinese government, and you think about the lame notifications that people affected by those breaches got, it gives you sort of a yardstick to judge your own breach response against. But basically, what Article 33 says is you have 72 hours from the time you become aware of the breach to notify the designated data protection regulator in any country that contains people who are affected by the breach. So think about that for a second. You're a US company, you suffer a breach, you have customers in Europe. What do? Are you required to make that notification? I'm going to be as clear as I possibly can. I am not a GDPR person, and I am not an attorney, so I can't tell you with the force of advice that you are legally required to do it. but you should probably plan on doing it. So you have 72 hours. That clock starts ticking from the minute you become aware that the breach exists. The clock does not stop. It's not 72 hours of business time. It's not 72 hours unless it's my wife's birthday or Christmas Eve or it happens on my vacation. 72 hours. And that notification has to have some very specific data items in it. The categories and approximate number of data subjects or records that were involved in the breach. So for example, you might say, I think I lost the social security number and birth dates and names of every US service member who has had their promotion presented to Congress for confirmation. That was an actual breach. Or you might say, we lost one data file that had payroll information for our employees in our office in Luxembourg. Whatever the scope is, you have to disclose that to the regulator. The name and the contact details of your data protection officer. In other words, who does a regulator call when they want to ask questions and or shake their fist at you? What are the likely consequences of the breach? Now, this is interesting because if your breach is, oh, somebody stole an email list of our customers, well, really the most likely consequence is that your customers are going to be slightly more likely to get annoying spam. Unless you're Ashley Madison or another business where customers have a really, strongly vested interest in not having anyone know that they are a customer of yours. And then measures taken or proposed to address the breach. In other words, what are you going to do about it? Are you going to shoot your security people into the sun? Are you going to completely remove your computers and networks from the internet? Are you going to make sure that you've done a thorough security audit? Are you going to buy credit monitoring for people who are affected, et cetera? Now, here's what I'm going to make really, really clear. This is what you are required to do. What the regulator is required to do when they get that notification is more or less completely up to the individual country. So, for example, what the British regulators may do could be very different than what French regulators or German regulators will do. Okay, that's not prescribed in the GDPR. The other thing that's not prescribed, and I want to say this as clearly as I possibly can so that no one misunderstands. Ignorance of these requirements is not going to help you. But my personal belief is that if you can make a good faith explanation for why the breach occurred, you are much less likely to be fined or otherwise punished. In other words, come clean with the notification. Don't try to sugarcoat it. Don't try to sweep the details under the rug. I think it's very likely that the first major cases we see of people being fined under this notification are going to be because the companies that suffered the breach were grossly negligent, or because they try to conceal the evidence and sweep it under the rug. I genuinely believe that if you're making a good faith effort to do these things, that the regulators are not going to fine, especially smaller companies, just because they can. That doesn't serve anybody's interests. So check back in a year or two and I'll let you know whether that prediction came true. Now at this point, you probably have some questions. Starting with, the big enchilada, how do I know if I've been breached? How can I tell? If I think I might have been breached, how will I know what the scope of the breach was? How will I know which files or services may have been affected? How will I figure out what data might have been lost during the breach? And as you answer those three questions, that's going to help you understand how you know which customers, which employees, which business partners, which business operations, which countries might have been affected. And of course, the overarching question for all this is, how on earth am I going to do all this within 72 hours or less? Okay, it's a complicated problem because when you think about all the different places where you might have data that could potentially fall under the protection requirements of GDPR, you almost certainly have some in Office 365. Unless you're a small enough organization that you have no resources on-prem, you probably have at least some of this data in an on-prem CRM system, in an on-prem file share, locally stored on your employees' desktop or laptop computers in your offices, and so on. That's leaving aside all the other places that you might have data scattered around, right? If you think about it, for example, suppose that I mail my marketing department a list of leads that I got at Microsoft Ignite from working in our booth. And then let's further say that, well, as long as we're making up fantasy scenarios, let's imagine that I have a cabin at a lake somewhere. And in that cabin, I have a laptop. And on that laptop, there's a cached copy of my mailbox. If someone breaks into that cabin and steals my laptop, as far as GDPR is concerned, they've just gotten that data. But as an administrator or as a person who is responsible for maintaining data security, it's pretty hard to say that you have to know where every employee device is and where every employee might have squirreled away some of this sensitive data. So it's a tricky problem to solve. So to start solving it, or to help you start solving it, what do you need? First, you need to be able to quickly identify the scope, the impact, and the nature of a potential breach. Now notice I'm leaving one big step off here. I'm not saying anything about breach detection for a couple of reasons. One is that Microsoft doesn't truly provide any services that are useful in any context for breach detection in Office 365. They give you a bunch of tools to try to keep attackers out, such as Exchange Online protection, advanced threat protection. They give you some tools for auditing what people have done to help you scope what might have been breached. But they don't have anything like an intrusion detection system. And they don't really have anything other than DLP auditing to help you understand when somebody might have created a compromise. And so actually, with that said, DLP can be very useful in this context because it lets you look for data that you know is sensitive, such as social security numbers or passport numbers or other personally identifiable and personally identifying information. It lets you scan for that and generate audit data that says, hey, on this date, Paul mailed a file that looked like it had 5 passport numbers in it to this outside recipient to help you establish an audit trail of what's been happening. The next thing that you need is you need to be able to give very comprehensive answers to some fairly difficult questions. What happened? When did it happen? Who was affected? And what else might have happened around the same time? So if you look at the very large scale intrusion detection and security management, or what are called SIEM systems, something like Leviathan's products, for example, they're oriented toward trying to give you a comprehensive view of everything that might have happened across every event log and every audit resource for every firewall and switch and domain controller and file server, etc. And that can be really useful, but it also can be really overwhelming because if you look at this last bullet, remember what must be reported in the 72-hour windows, the regulator, they're not asking you to tell them exactly how the breach occurred. They're not looking for you to do a forensic analysis of a device or a network and come back and say, oh, well, the attacker dropped this particular malware on this machine and they phished these credentials and then they did this and then they did this. That's very useful and interesting to know, and it's very helpful when you're trying to remediate and make sure that you don't get breached using the same vector in the future. But that's not what they're asking for. What you need is an ability to quickly pull this data together and present it to regulators. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to show you a quick demo of the Radar security and audit product that we proudly make. So let me find where I put that. Okay, what you're looking at right now in Radar is the dashboard for the Radar security and audit module. We call this the audit timeline, and you can see right now I've got just a graph showing me that some things have been happening, which users have been doing things, and which operations have been most common. So this is all interesting, but from a GDPR perspective, perhaps not exactly what I care about. But then when I scroll down, I can see, okay, I've got a timeline showing me actions that people have taken in the system. So Rochelle logged in from somewhere in the US. Rochelle logged in from the US. Rochelle logged in. Okay, Rochelle added a site collection administrator. Well, okay, maybe that's a little odd, depending on what she does. But as I scroll through this, I can see that there are different permissions entries and different activities that are taking place by different users. So suppose I have reason to think that a breach might have occurred. Let me give you a real world case of this. We have a customer whose chief financial officer was attacked with a spear phishing campaign. And I'm sad to say that it fooled him. So he gave up his credentials, or his credentials were stolen. I guess the customer wasn't able to share with us conclusive proof of how the credentials got out. But we looked in the audit timeline. It's very clear exactly what had happened. Along about the time that the attacker was able to access his mailbox, they sent email to an outside vendor that we had done some business with and claimed that the vendor's payment arrangements needed to be changed to a different bank. Now, the vendor was quite rightly suspicious of this, so called back and said, hey, Mr. CFO, why are you doing this? This is kind of odd. And of course, the CFO said, well, I didn't do that. And that's how the company first became aware that some kind of breach had occurred. They're very quickly able to come into the timeline and say, hey, let's take a look. I want to see exactly what had been done. So they were able to filter. Oops, wait a minute. Tell us if I put in the right username. Did I spell that wrong? Okay, hang on one second while I grab the URL for my demo again. Okay, that's more like it. So from the timeline, I can come through here and I can say, okay, I want to see the activities that have taken place. And you can see a pretty long list of things that we audited here, including Teams activities, modifying administrative units, adding users, giving people access to things, sharing, creating sharing invitations, taking SharePoint permissions, creating objects in SharePoint, and so on. So what this allows me to do, if I want to go in here and say, show me wherever users were added. Okay, then I see I've got one activity there. Well, okay, that's probably not of interest. Where I think I'm going, let's see, what I'm looking for is Exchange mailbox activities. There's an action in here for creating a PowerShell forwarding rule. And rather than fumble around looking for it, since I misremembered its name, I'll just talk through the process that we used for helping the customer identify this breach. What we saw when we looked at the audit report was that, and scoped it to the CFO's account, that there were some particular things that the customer had done, or sorry, that the compromised CFO account had done. One of them was the attacker had created a PowerShell forwarding rule to forward every inbound message to the CFO's mailbox to an external Gmail account. And there was a corresponding rule that would automatically delete any message that bounced back from the Gmail account. So essentially, the attacker was able to tee off a copy of the CFO's mail and see everything that he saw, including back and forths about the invoice and so on. That's what triggered the call from the vendor. The vendor thought, hey, I'm going to call because the email account may have been compromised. And sure enough, that's exactly what happened. So by using those tools, the customer was able to very quickly figure out what had happened. The CFO account had been compromised. The attacker had gotten some amount of email, and we were able to quickly identify in the audit timeline exactly what mail messages were delivered to that particular account between the time the compromise occurred and the time they changed the password and sanitized that machine. And so armed with that, if you think about what you have to be able to tell people about GDPR, okay, the scope, impact, and nature. Well, the nature was the CFO's mailbox was compromised. The CFO's account was compromised. So everything that the audit timeline showed the CFO account as having done is potentially suspect. So by filtering on that account, the customer was very quickly able to home in on, okay, during this time, did that account share any files? Did it open any data? Did it access anything anywhere in Office 365? And the answer was yes. So by looking at the documents, then the response team was able to very quickly understand what the scope and the impact of the breach were. Some customer data was exposed, but not much. And it only affected a very small number of customers and vendors that the CFO had been talking to about payment. So I guess the best outcome of all this was, because this happened before GDPR, there was no formal notification requirement. But the customer came back to us and said, they just raved about how quick and easy it was for them to identify what could have been a very messy set of details around that breach. So what Radar gives you, first of all, is a comprehensive view of user and administrator activities. So you saw from the timeline, everything that a user does in Office 365 that can be audited shows up in the timeline. So we also have the ability to ingest audit data from on-prem servers. So for example, you can grab audit data about successful and failed logons from domain controllers, or successful or failed file access from a file server, and integrate that into the audit timeline. So that a single view, you can see literally every file that a user has touched or attempted to touch, everything that they've logged into, basically everything that they've done in the system. The same for administrators. Don't underestimate this, right? It's a completely separate problem. And one question that I used to get all the time in the Exchange world was, well, how do I know, or how do I prevent my administrator from reading email I don't want her to see? Right? Some of you probably had that exact same query. Hey, I don't want my admin reading the CEO's email. How do I stop her from doing that? Well, the short answer is you can't. Right? That's what being an administrator means, that you have access to do things like that. The somewhat longer answer is you stop them with the sheriff or the police. And the really long answer is you don't stop them in advance, but you audit their activity. And when you see a pattern of activity that you don't like, you investigate and then you turn it over to law enforcement if that's appropriate. So being able to have a single point to view all of the admin changes that were made, when they were made, who made them, what their impact was, is super useful. Now, we also have the ability to fire notifications when something unusual happens, but you get to define what's unusual. So for example, inside Quadratech, it's very usual for our sales team to share documents with customers. So what might be unusual behavior for a developer would be considered unusual for the sales team and vice versa. Right? If I have a sales account that suddenly is sniffing around in our source code repositories and generating failed logins against those machines, I would definitely like to know that. On the other hand, if I have a sales guy who normally shares 10 files a day and tomorrow shares 500, that might be worth investigating as well. Filtering and search tools to cut down the noise level. I mean, if you have more than a few dozen mailboxes on Office 365, you're going to see a lot of data being generated by the audit logs. But Radar gives you a way to filter and search and sort and view that data in only the slices that make sense for you. so that instead of being overwhelmed, right, this is the problem that TSA has when their screeners are looking at luggage images all day, every day, looking to see if people have contraband in their luggage. It's really hard to pay attention when you're flooded with the same data over and over and over and over and over. Okay, so we help you filter that out and focus on the diamonds instead of having to look at every single thing that's in the log. Now, this last point is really important. Microsoft has already got auditing tools built into Office 365. And one common question we get is, hey, why would I buy your tool when Microsoft will give me this for free? Well, there are a couple reasons. One is that Microsoft didn't give it to you for free. They put the data out there, but the tools they give you for filtering, searching, and sorting it, or assembling it into a single timeline, either don't exist or are not free. So if you want their premium security audit capability, the Windows Defender Advanced Threat Protection for on-prem, then you're going to have to buy that. You're going to have to buy Azure AD P2 licenses and Defender ATP. What we do is we take the data that Microsoft is already generating in Azure and the data that they're already generating in Office 365 and unify it for you. So you have a single view alongside whatever on-prem data you choose to collect of all the activity. So identity management activities such as creating users or successful or failed in login attempts through ADFS, through password hash sync, doesn't matter. Office 365 gathers the audit data about what users are doing with data that's in Office 365 and what administrative actions have been taken. We roll all that up into a single dashboard so that you can see it, research it, understand it, and notify based on it faster than you can with Microsoft's own tools. So with that said, I want to stop and see if there are any questions before I go on to tell you how to set up a radar trial or where to find us at Microsoft Ignite. Emma, I don't know if you've been collecting questions that have gone along, and frankly, I don't know how to turn on the button that lets people ask questions via audio, so I'm going to leave that to you. Okay, well, with that, I'm going to assume that there aren't any questions. Maybe. Let's see. Normally on a webinar like this, I would prepare some questions, but the big ones I prepared are the ones that I asked earlier about how am I going to deal with all this? I guess, the one question that I would give you as a takeaway to think about is, even if you don't believe you're subject to GDPR, right? If you're a US entity like a university system or some other kind of business that doesn't have any business presence in Europe, you might think about whether there are other legal requirements or regulatory requirements that require breach detection and remediation. So for example, if you are required to comply with HIPAA, and I want to be super clear that the breach notification requirements for HIPAA or for FERPA, the Federal Educational Privacy Act that applies to secondary education in the US, HIPAA, FERPA, these other regulatory regimes, their requirements are different than the ones that apply to GDPR, but they're similar in that they require you to understand what sensitive data you might have and to be able to identify when that data has been compromised and who might have gotten a hold of it. So although we don't talk about that in this particular context, the same mechanisms that I've talked about here for, remember that the 6-part cycle with notification being the 6th part, that is just as applicable to you if you are a regulated financial institution, if you're subject to FERPA, if you're subject to HIPAA, if you're subject to Gramm-Leach-Bliley, if you're subject to NYRR 500, those are all regulatory regimes that have similar requirements that Radar can help you with. So with that said, what I will do now is move on to the call to action. If you go to reports.o365radar.com, then you can sign up for a free trial of Radar. The nice thing about the free trial is all the features are unlocked. So all the reporting that helps you understand what users are doing, what resources they're using, which activities are taking place in the system, along with all the security and audit data, all collected at a single place, all with super easy to read, super easy to understand dynamic reports with filtering, searching, subscriptions. All of the features that Radar includes are available in the demo for 14 days. So there's no reason not to try it. There's nothing to install. The sign-up process takes about 2.5 minutes. So I encourage you to take a look at it and see whether you think it's a good fit for you based on what you've learned today. There's a lot more detail about Radar and all of our products at our website, quadratech-it.com. And then for those of you that are going to be at Microsoft Ignite coming up in September, we have a booth there. I think the number is 157. I'm not entirely sure. But I'll be there. The rest of my product management team will be there to talk in technical depth about what these products can do. I'm also going to be doing a slightly shortened version of this seminar at the Partner Theater. If you want to come up and ask questions that you thought of after this presentation, but before the next one, you're more than welcome to, or you're welcome to email me at the email address that was on the first slide, paul@quadro.tech. I did just get a question that I didn't think to answer before, and I probably should have, which is about how Radar is licensed and priced. So it's per mailbox. That makes it very simple because we license it according to the same mailbox rules that Microsoft uses. So however many Office 365 mailboxes or, mailbox licenses you pay for, whether those are kiosk licenses, P1, P2, E3, E5. If you're paying Microsoft, you pay us. Now, the good news is that means that you're not penalized if you have shared mailboxes or resource mailboxes, inactive mailboxes, archive mailboxes. We don't charge for any of those, just for user mailboxes. Now, from a packaging standpoint, one other thing, last thing I want to leave you with is that one of the things I like most about Radar is that it's a true SaaS application. So unless you want to, you're not required to install anything on premises. There's nothing to update, there's nothing to manage. You sign into the product, you saw what the sign-in process looks like. You sign into the product, it starts collecting data, and you start getting reports. So it's portable. You don't have anything to install or update. There's no servers to reboot, none of that nonsense. So with that said, I'd like to thank you all for attending. As Emma said at the beginning of the webinar, you'll all be receiving an email in a day or two with a link to the session recording if you want to see it again. And I thank you for attending. I hope you all enjoy the rest of your week.